Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her. In this episode, we'll discuss the fifth Sunday in Lent, which this year falls on the 3rd of April. We do have one content note for you this episode. During the deep dive, we talk about racism and colonization and related topics.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
So this week, our deep dive is on church abundance versus extravagance. We've talked about the theology of abundance on this podcast before, and how God does provide for us abundantly. But when do you cross that line from celebrating abundance into extravagance, into going too far?
Mm-hmm.
Now, a common topic that has been discussed throughout the history of the church, and I really mean all the way back 2,000 years for this topic, has been the concept of icons and building decoration versus plain walls in churches. Icons are an item that is well known throughout the Orthodox Church, but lesser known throughout other branches of the church.
Although they're making a comeback.
Oh, yes, absolutely. They are generally used as a focus for your prayer life. If you grew up folding your hands and closing your eyes while you were praying, that's one way to make sure that you're focusing on your prayer while you are praying. But another way is to have something to look at, like, say, a candle or a cross or a painting of a saint who might inspire you.
Mm-hmm.
And also, icons were often used to teach, especially the history of the church and the various saints, but also plenty of icons are out there of characters in the Bible, and so each icon would have a few identifying characteristics of the person who it's of, so that you could tell, oh, this is of St. Nicholas, oh, this is of Zacchaeus, oh, this is of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. They would each have very obvious... Absolutely. They would each have a few things that they might be carrying or might be behind them or nearby, or something telling about their clothing, and that would tell you who they were. And that was part of how they taught Bible stories and how they taught the history of the church before the time when most people could read.
Yeah. Icons were one way to do that, but that's also a lot of, like, stained glass.
Yes.
Windows are connected to that as well. The idea that you can look at the windows, whether it's, a lot of Catholic churches have the Stations of the Cross, for example,
Sure.
But you can look at windows and see a story from the Bible depicted, or a progression of things, or it could say, like, the Ten Commandments. There are a lot of Lutheran churches that have the sacraments really visible in some way, that sort of a thing.
And way back when, people came up with different symbols to indicate each of the Gospels or various other topics in the Bible. And so you might see in the corner of a stained glass window depicting a Bible story, you might see a little symbol that tells you, oh, this one comes from St. Luke, this one comes from St. Mark, this one comes from St. John, because each of them had a different symbol.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are actually books you can buy that will teach you Christian iconography, or the way to read these various symbols that you'll find all around the world in different churches.
Mm-hmm. And some of the symbols, there are actually also some kids' books that have different symbols of Christianity.
Yes.
Most of them probably don't go into, like, why a gospel is depicted by a certain animal, but do have kind of the bigger picture of butterflies. Why are butterflies important in Christianity? That sort of thing.
Yeah. And for the record, butterflies are important in Christianity because they're a symbol of new life, which we happen to talk about a lot, say, around Easter.
Yes, indeed. One of the things that frequently gets kind of pitted against each other in the conversation around, like, abundance and extravagance versus humbleness. So one of the contrasts that comes up in this kind of a conversation is a contrast between smells and bells church. So a church that in worship is very high liturgy. They might use incense, they use fancy music and fancy, like, church bells, organs, those sorts of things.
You say particular things at particular times. There's a lot of call and response, and it's all written down, and it's either in the bulletin or in a hymnal or that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's all pretty set. Versus a low liturgy church where there's, music and prayer and preaching and maybe communion, but it's not as set, it's not as formal, it doesn't feel as formal to folks. Some people, right, call it simple. Some people talk about it as like a praise and worship style. There are different ways to do it, to do any of those. But the contrast ends up being like, oh, the smells and bells churches, the high liturgy churches have all the fancy stuff and it's so extravagant. But the low liturgy ones are just like simple and more to the heart. That can be one of the contrasts. And that's actually like this really false binary because both, because it's me, and so I have to point that out.
We didn't even get to the 9-minute mark. Good job.
I try. So that's part of it, but also because you can spend a lot of money. You can be extravagant on anything. I have served congregations that are more high liturgy and have, simple binders. Maybe they change color with the season, but maybe they don't. And like very simple stuff that gets used over and over again. So they might buy high quality stuff that costs more, but it lasts a long time. And I've served congregations that want really simple, low liturgy style, but have really fancy sound systems or have really tacky banners up on the wall, or have really nice banners that are not tacky up on the wall.
But were also not homemade and given to the church as a gift by members of the congregation, for example.
Yeah. There's a lot of different ways to do it, and so like that kind of pitting high liturgy against low liturgy is not actually helpful or accurate when we talk about that.
I would also say that one of the unspoken contrasts of those two types of worship style is that when the worship service is set in advance and there is that back and forth, the traditional definition of liturgy is the work of the people, or the work of the church. And it's work that the worship leaders and the congregation do together. And you can tell that it's participatory because people are constantly doing back and forth. The Lord be with you and also with you. And there's a bunch of set and easy to remember call and response things.
And people come up and serve as readers and assisting ministers. And it's not just like...
It's not one or
usually,
two people or just
ideally,
the band.
it's not just one.
Yeah. Whereas I've been to lower liturgy services that feel less like a worship service and more like a concert. Now, that's not always true. And most of us, I think, grew up somewhere in the middle. I grew up personally in a church that, we didn't do incense, we didn't do extra bells during service, just one to start the service with. And we certainly didn't have technology in the sanctuary. But I suppose it probably came across to people who weren't used to it as high liturgy. We used services in the front of the hymnal every week. And usually there's a nice balance you can strike.
Yeah.
And is it better to buy a set of hymnals once 20 years ago and use them for, 40 years or however long they last? Or is it better to buy a really expensive sound system that you're going to have to replace in 15 years and also spend a ton on printing out your bulletins every week in between now and then?
And this is like, this a little bit sounds like we're kind of being more judgmental of like lower liturgy or that sort of thing.
No, it can be beautifully done. Absolutely.
It can be really well done, and it can be really fancy schmancy. It can be really extravagant. And I think one of the spaces where that's clearest is probably not in the small congregations, the small worshiping communities, which are the majority of the communities that Kay and I have served. I think the contrast for both of these and where it gets to be extravagance, maybe more than abundance, for both in terms of high liturgy and low liturgy, happens the larger the congregation is.
Yes.
So it's more likely to happen if it's a really large congregation and they have high liturgy, and it's more likely to be extra fancy. But also, like, mega churches, for example.
Yes. Or, for that matter, the ancient version of megachurches, which were called cathedrals. A cathedral you would find in a very large town because there'd be a lot of people there, and oddly enough, the more people you have, the more money you have, the more resources you have, the bigger your church gets. And that is an ancient pattern that we've seen. One cathedral in particular brings this whole question of church abundance versus extravagance to mind, because I made a trip in seminary, actually my only trip out of the country so far, to Geneva, Switzerland. And there I saw the St. Peter Cathedral, or the Saint Pierre Cathedral, if you want to be French. And that was the cathedral that was taken over by John Calvin and his followers once he basically, arrived and took over Geneva. And before John Calvin took it over, it had been very thoroughly painted and decorated. In the tradition of medieval Catholic churches, there were paintings and decorations everywhere, and all of them were of saints or Bible stories. All of them could have been used in instructional ways. And everywhere you look, there would have been something to look at, basically. And there is still a little side chapel, or at least there was 15 years ago when I was there, that was still very thoroughly decorated. I think they told us it was because the door wound up getting blocked with like some bookcases or something, and so the folks that were with Calvin never got in there, and then it was discovered years later. And
That's
they
funny.
restored it. And you look inside this tiny little side chapel, and the riot of color once they were done with the restoration was just extraordinary. And we'll link to an article that has some photos of not that particular cathedral, but various similar cathedrals having been restored to show that contrast. Because the main part of the St. Peter Cathedral, all of the paint, all of the decorations had been removed, and all that was left was the plain gray stonework. And don't get me wrong, it's still a cathedral. It's still an enormous sanctuary, extremely tall ceilings, gorgeous columns. There is still some statuary in there too. I think they were able to take the painting down and remove the paint so that it was all very plain, but I think they quailed a little at the concept of like trying to take statues down from the roof of the cathedral sanctuary, which frankly I wouldn't want to do that either. That's fine.
Yeah.
And so the contrast of that was extraordinary. But ultimately speaking, like, the cathedral was still there. It was still a usable building. Of course they were going to keep using it. You weren't going to rip the whole thing down and try to rebuild, because that's just a bunch of useless wasted labor when it's there already.
Well, and that's like partly cathedrals, right? Part of why they're called cathedrals, or also basilicas,
Yes.
is because that's like the seat of the bishop
Right.
a lot of the time. And so there is always more fancy schmancy when a bishop is involved. 100% of the time, even if they try not to be that way.
Also, really fancy hats. The hats are the best part.
I like the crooks.
Those are fun too. Well,
They're
you're
cute.
apparently not supposed to smack people with them. I mean, you're not supposed to smack people with the hats either. I feel like I need to be clear about that. But hats aren't really designed for that either. So,
Yeah. So, but that's part of why it's extra fancy a lot
Yes.
of the time. So also the complicated part about cathedrals and the fancy churches, and my examples are, most of my travels have been in Latin America, and so Catholicism is kind of the dominant
yes.
religion there. And part of where extravagance is really problematic is when it is in fact on top of holy sites of indigenous people, or
Sure.
built quite literally on the backs of enslaved peoples.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of really gorgeous churches and cathedrals, and there's one in Quito, Ecuador, that is like all gold, and you're not allowed to take pictures in it, and it's gorgeous. And also there's a giant mural in the back that depicts like heaven and hell, and surprising none of us, the lighter the skin, the closer the people are to heaven.
Yeah.
The darker the skin, the closer they are to hell. And so there's like those sorts of things that the extravagance, when the extravagance comes from racism, comes from oppression, that is not okay. That's not part of the abundance that God calls us to. God calls us to abundance for everyone, for all of creation, not just for those with power and access.
Right. And also, there's a heck of a cognitive dissonance when you walk out of a gorgeously decorated, literally gold-plated church into a neighborhood that is filled with poverty.
Mm-hmm.
But again, there's also a balance you can strike. If you have a beautifully decorated church, you can keep a lot of those decorations. Like the paint isn't, causing any extra poverty at this point. But you can also take that gold and sell it and give it to the poor and replace it with, say, brass or plain metal. Most of the churches that I've worked in have brass crosses and silver colored but not actually silver trays and things like that. And if you do common cup, you need to have a silver chalice because that has antibacterial properties, but that's also not a huge layout, that kind of thing. You can have beautiful things and not spend everything on the church and ignore the poor people outside your door.
And the beautiful things don't have to be precious metals, right? Some of my favorite beautiful things are murals that have been painted by people in the community or that have been commissioned by the church from a local artist.
Absolutely.
Right? There are ways to not only, especially because, and this is a criticism that a lot of people have of churches, churches are tax exempt. So if you're going to be in a community, you have to be intentional about spending money in the community, about investing in the community, because the default of you being there is actually sucking away resources from the community because you're not paying taxes and you're getting the benefits. And so if you have a local community and there's an artist, or if you want, there's Trinity Lutheran Church of Manhattan on the Upper West Side in Manhattan has this beautiful portrait, and it includes the Virgen de Guadalupe and Frederick Douglass and this beautiful rainbow. And it's because that reflects the community that makes up the congregation and the community that they're in, because they're right across from the Frederick Douglass housing project.
Sure.
Right? So it's a way of investing in and reflecting and making the building, the fancy building, work for the community, right?
Yeah.
There's a transitional housing shelter for LGBTQ youth in the building. They are making the fancy stuff actually function for the community, which feeds into the abundance.
Absolutely.
That makes it abundance for abundance.
And encouraging people whose lives suck to be near beautiful things, to be in beautiful spaces, to give them a time of being able to exist in a beautiful space. Sometimes that's one of the few things that the church can give people, and that is still sacred and helpful.
Yeah, and it's not just like encouraging people to do that, but actually like being the ones to say, when people are saying, oh, why do they get whatever?
Because they're beloved children of God.
To be in there and say, everyone deserves beauty, everyone deserves that space. And it's hard because capitalism and classism and all of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not going to be easy. But there are some fairly simple lines we can draw. To jump back to our topic of megachurches, which we talked about earlier. Having a large congregation in itself is not necessarily a bad thing, especially in a very populous community. A large congregation can offer things that a smaller congregation can't. It's much easier for them to offer services that cater to particular demographics, especially to, say, people who need a lower level of sound and stimulation during worship. So autism and autoimmune-friendly services are very often available in big cities, but it's harder to find them when you're, out in the boonies where the same 40 families have been attending this congregation for 5 million years. Or megachurches can offer a whole bunch of different educational opportunities. They can definitely raise more money to send more kids to camp in an affordable way. They can offer book studies and different spiritual practice experiences to their people because they have the resources to do that. And all of that is great. And especially recently with the explosion of having online resources available during the pandemic, those congregations can now offer those resources to even more people, which is wonderful. That does not mean that the head pastor of that congregation needs to have their own private jet. I'm just saying. I
don't think
believe
anyone needs to have their own private jet.
Yeah, I am perfectly happy to say that anyone who works a full-time job, including a clergy person, deserves to have, say, transportation that is safe and in good shape and preferably reasonably comfortable for them to get themselves around. And so I don't think that a pastor has to own a 20-year-old car. For generations in the Protestant tradition in America, it was standard that the pastor was expected to own a black car because those were cheaper. These days, that's not actually true. And also, like, my SUV is bright red because that was what was on the lot that day. So, uh, I I think that we can say you don't need to have a private jet, but yes, you can have a car that actually works.
Yeah.
You don't need to have a yacht, but yes, you should have a housing situation that is reasonably comfortable and in good shape and actually provides for your needs. That kind of
And
thing.
that's something that everyone should have,
Exactly.
right?
Like,
It's
let's
not
treat
just a
everyone that way.
like
Yeah.
employed person or pastor or clergy. Like we part of the UN Declaration on Human Rights includes shelter.
Yes, absolutely.
And if we
And while we're at it, healthcare sounds like a great plan, but now we're probably wandering a tad off
you
topic.
know, that'd be awesome. Yeah. I think a lot of the times, so in the space of like how these sorts of conversations are framed, some of it is the like high liturgy versus low liturgy, smells and bells kinds of thing. And some of it is like the mega churches, like you were mentioning, Kay, that like people look at Joel Osteen, for example, and are like, ugh, we should not be letting churches not pay taxes. But they're not looking at the small congregations doing really important work in the community, running backpack programs, hosting union meetings. Those are also the congregations
Yep.
that are doing really important things. And yeah, they're tax exempt. That's part of what lets them do that because they're not having to pay taxes on everything.
Also, it's just the church that's tax exempt, not the people. Joel Osteen
Mm-hmm.
still pays income tax, and so do the rest of us.
Yes, although the like housing allowance thing gets a little tricky. But
Taxes are weird.
one of the questions that I think is the most helpful for me in thinking about is this abundance? Is this extravagance? Is who or what does the abundance, does the decoration, does the potential extravagance point towards?
Sure.
When I think about megachurches, and I am totally biased against megachurches because most of them are at least low key queerphobic, but a lot of them are theatrical, right? And
Sure.
Kay mentioned like a concert. Are they pointing towards God, or is the literal spotlight on people,
Right.
on the pastor, on the music group,
Is there even a
on
cross
the
that's
organ?
visible during the service?
Well, and I don't think a cross
I don't know
is,
that's strictly necessary, but like if you're going to
yeah,
have some
but
kind
like,
of
are there symbols
visual
of
thing, then
Christianity
yes, it
or
should be
of
Christian,
a particular
right?
faith? Yeah.
As opposed to just flashing lights.
Yeah. And like the movie Saved does a great job
Oh,
of
I love that
like
movie so much.
it's fantastic. It's hilarious.
I would love to get away with showing it to confirmation students every year, but sadly I'm not sure that their parents
That
would
would
like that
be
very much.
actually pretty amazing. They do a great job in that of showing like a church that is about extravagance and where it is a show and it's a performance and the pastor is the star and not God. And so that's
I mean, the pastors are never God, just to make that clear. But Emily was
yes,
saying that the
but
pastor
also
was the
like
star and God wasn't the star. So,
yes. And so that's something that is important to think about in experiencing a worship or a liturgy, but also in the decorations, right? When it's stained glass, so much of the stained glass is white Jesus
yep.
because of the context it was created in, despite the fact that there are plenty of like Black Madonna icons and those
Sure.
sorts of things.
Paintings too. I'm currently in some congregations that have some paintings of Jesus that were made by congregation members eons ago, and Jesus is always white. Yeah.
Yep, because they're predominantly white
Yep.
congregations. But one of the things that you can do in situations like that is update the stained glass. It's actually like in the realm of stained glass. It's not the most difficult thing to change Jesus' skin color.
Yeah.
You can do that. A lot of those are painted onto the glass anyway instead of being colored glass because they want to show like the facial features and stuff.
Yeah.
And a lot of folks who are doing stained glass now are doing very different stained glass. So, like we mentioned before, there's folks who do the sacraments. The seminary that I went to, the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, has the entire two of the sides of the sanctuary are all windows, and there are some stained glass panels that kind of move on rollers. But the idea is, and they're just like abstract colors, but the idea is that you experience worship while looking into the community, right?
Sure.
So if you're receiving communion, you're looking, and right behind the table are these beautiful windows, and you can see people, buses passing by, people walking dogs or going for walks. And it's this beautiful, like, the way that particular abundance, that beauty works, is to draw us into the community, to make us more connected to the community.
Yeah.
Doesn't always work that way, but
There was also a old British TV show, and by old I mean like from the 80s, called The Vicar of Dibley, which is beloved by a lot of church people because there are realistic
hilarious.
aspects to it, but it's also hilarious, and also like there's a certain amount of rose-colored glasses going on there. It's a very warm portrayal of church, and there's an episode where they are getting I think they're getting their stained glass windows restored, or possibly like some of them broke and they're getting them fixed. I don't remember. And they raise all this money for it. And they're so glad that they can get the stained glass windows fixed because they are really gorgeous stained glass windows. And the congregation, as small as they are and poor as they are, is very glad to have them. And then at the same time, there is also a disaster of some kind that they are made aware of. I think it's a flood in a like neighboring community or something. And then they have to make a decision. And what they wind up doing is they replace the stained glass windows with clear glass, and they send the rest of the money that they had raised to this neighboring community that had this flood. And as it happens, that nice clear glass looks out on the churchyard, and it's a beautiful view of trees and the cemetery and the local neighborhood. And they're perfectly happy to have those too. So.
And in fact, it lets more light in.
It does.
That's like, stained glass is beautiful when it's sunny out, but also it makes it way darker in the building.
Yeah, it does.
In the worship space. And there's a gift in being able to utilize the sun.
Yeah. And to be honest, like probably replacing the stained glass windows with regular glass did cost a little more money than your normal window would, because it would have had to have been shaped, and it would need larger panes and all that. And so, yeah, it still cost a little money, but also they were able to send the balance to help people. And I really appreciated that episode as an example of abundance versus
beautiful.
Extravagance.
Yeah. So, obviously, we have not come to any conclusions of this is how you clearly categorize abundance and extravagance.
Aside from maybe the whole private jet thing.
Yes, aside from private jets and literally enslaving people.
Don't do that. Yeah.
Those are the two big no's that we came up with.
I would hope you would expect those, like, from us by this point. We've been doing this a little while, but yeah.
Right. But I do think, like, part of what we're getting at is that there are a lot of different ways to live into God's abundance, and it's worth sharing our gifts to do that, right?
Yeah.
There's a book.
So there is a colleague of ours who is named Amber Beldine. I don't know that if she uses reverend or pastor or another title off the top of my head. But she wrote a few romance novels that are enjoyable. And Emily is thinking of the second one, which is called...
Actually, no, I'm thinking of the third one. Not Another Rock Star.
Okay, I have not read that one.
Not Another Rock Star by Amber Beldine. And Susanna, the priest in the congregation, they have like I want to say it's a dinner, but it might be a food pantry or something where a lot of people experiencing homelessness are coming through. And one of the like kids of a congregation member or something is a rock star.
Sure.
And they have like a situation where like their usual organist can't do it, and so he's been filling in. And she gets the idea of like having him play while people are waiting in line and getting food and that sort of a thing. And it's this beautiful like moment of being really clear for her that the people who are coming to receive food also deserve the beauty of music and a concert.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I've thought about a lot, and we talked about when we were doing vaccine clinics of like, are there ways that we can provide instrumental music or something to accompany people while they're like waiting in line for vaccines or that sort of a thing?
Sure.
At the congregation I used to serve. And so it's those sorts of things that like, those are ways that abundance matters in really positive ways.
Yeah.
And sharing in that is important.
As we learned it in Sesame Street.
Yes. And now, as we dive into our readings for this episode, our first reading is Isaiah chapter 43, verses 16 through 21. Isaiah declares that the God who delivered Israel from slavery in Egypt will also deliver them from exile in Babylon. So one of the things that comes up a lot in this reading is water. God provides it and God moves it around for people, and it is one of the easiest things for there to not be enough of in dystopias, right? There's Divergent is set in Chicago, and the lake has become a marsh because there's not enough water. But also that's the reality, right? In Palestine, the monopoly on water is Israel's monopoly, and the people of Palestine don't have enough access to water.
Yeah.
The movement at Standing Rock, part of the movement of indigenous peoples on Turtle Island are that water is life, that water is necessary, and it is frequently polluted.
Yeah.
Also, if you watch any documentary about elephants who live on the continent of Africa, they go searching for water, and they go from places with abundant water to other places with abundant water, and there's a lot of spaces in between that don't have enough water.
Sure.
Water is great. I love water. And elephants, which is why I had to talk about them.
Elephants are wonderful.
Mm-hmm. And then in verse 17, we read of God, that God is the one who brings out chariot and horse, army and warrior. They lie down, they cannot rise, they are extinguished, quenched like a wick. It's this very flowery, poetic, but it's not poetry, but it kind of is, telling of God's deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt. And it reminded me of the Lord of the Rings when Sam and Frodo, I think it's either that towards the end of Two Towers or towards the beginning of Return of the King, but Sam and Frodo are walking along with Smeagol, and Sam's like, I wonder if they'll tell stories about us. And goes into this, basically this ode to Frodo, right? Which all of the queer kids know that Frodo and Sam have a thing. All that intense
Excuse me, some of the straight people figured that one out too. But yes.
Well, congratulations. There's a lot of things that get past straight people.
Well, yeah, that's true.
But yeah, this one was a bit more obvious. But so it's this very poetic way of Sam being telling this about Frodo's triumphs, and then Frodo says, "But what about Sam? Frodo wouldn't have gotten anywhere without Sam." And it's
yeah, they're very sweet.
Yeah, very cute.
And then in verse 18 we read, "Do not remember the former things or consider the things of old." Okay, if you took this line out of context and just went with it all the time, that would probably not do you a lot of good, because learning history is important. I will grant you that.
Yes.
On the other hand, I have to say I may start quoting this verse during council meetings and things like that, because what worked in the 60s or the 80s may not work in the 2020s, folks. I hate to break it to you. Much like how I was reading this verse, and one of the things that immediately came to mind was the line that happened in one of the debates between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama during President Obama's attempt to get reelected, which, by the way, worked, where Mitt Romney was questioning the necessity of where Senator Romney was saying that we needed to have more battleships because the Navy had fewer battleships than they used to. And President Obama responded with, yes, they also have fewer bayonets, and explained that the needs of the military change over the years, and so do the needs of the church. But
also, the military could do with, fewer things in general.
Yes, absolutely. But
I had a similar line, though, because I was looking at the next verse, verse 19, where God says, I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. And my immediate thought was, too bad the church writ large, so denominations in particular, don't get this. Also, God is not just talking about a spin-off, right? So it's not just Angel getting his own spin-off in LA while Buffy stays in Sunnydale, or The Flash getting his spin-off from Arrow, but a real new thing that,
sure,
like you were saying, doesn't work the same as it did as what God was doing in the 60s or the 80s.
Right. also, like, a lot of things were going on in both the 60s and the 80s that the church doesn't want to talk about either. But that's
Mm-hmm.
a whole separate series of
And
conversations.
conveniently, there's a lot going on in the
Right
2020s
now,
that the church
yes,
doesn't want to talk about.
it's possible that we both may be just a tad bitter on this subject, so we'll move on. And then in verse 20 we read, "The wild animals will honor me, the jackals and the ostriches, for I give water in the wilderness, rivers in the desert, to give drink to my chosen people," God says. And I have to say, I don't usually think of jackals and ostriches hanging out together. Like, that is not one of the immediate Disney movies that comes to mind, but I do actually kind of want this Disney movie now. It's an interesting choice about how there's a jackal and an ostrich and they're best friends. On one condition, though, it cannot have an ending like The Fox and the Hound. I absolutely refuse. That is a hugely depressing movie.
Yeah.
So
if you don't know,
they just
definitely
get to
look
stay
at
friends.
Does the Dog Die?
Yeah.
That's actually a great one to look at for all of the movies ever, because it will warn you if things like
terrible things
dogs
happen.
Die. And other terrible things.
Yeah, I just think that would make a fun animated series. Not everything has to be Muppets, I suppose.
Oh my gosh. A Muppet ostrich and a Muppet jackal.
The Muppet ostrich would be huge fun. I'm not really sure, like, making a jackal that is clearly a jackal as a Muppet would be kind of difficult. Something about
I mean, the ostrich would
be a little
probably, like, get along great with Big Bird.
Yeah, I think the ostrich and Big Bird would basically wind up taking over the show. But our second reading for this episode is from Philippians chapter 3, verse 4b through 14. Paul reminds the people of Philippi that God's love for us is not based on our heritage or anything we've done to earn it, because Christ has put us all in right relationship with God.
So Paul is doing this thing he does of, like, look at all of this, but actually that's not how God works. And in this case, it starts out with credentialing and credentials, and he gives his, like, whole credentials of how he is the best qualified. And I know a variety of particularly marginalized and oppressed people who have to do that in order to be accepted into the room. But my favorite is in the Expanse series, the one who becomes Secretary General Christian Avasarala has actually, like, legit a ton of credentials, because she has been the United Nations Deputy Undersecretary of Executive Administration, the Interim General Secretary, the General Secretary, a Secretary to facilitate emigration to interstellar colonies, and again, the Acting General Secretary. She has done a lot, and that's just what we see during the series. That doesn't count all of the, like, positions she had as she worked her way through the ranks.
Sure.
But the thing that makes her her is the way that she continues to grow and learn and change.
Yeah.
And admit when she has done things badly.
Yay! More people like that, please.
Mm-hmm.
And then in verse 4b, we read, "If anyone else has reason to be confident in the flesh, I have more." Okay, look, we have been doing this podcast for a year and a half now. We did a podcast before that for about 3 years. I have been controlling myself in what I feel is a deeply admirable way.
Let it go.
And
Let
I'm
it go.
also, totally humble about that. But I would just like to say out loud for once that this is the worst pickup line ever, Paul. Like, no. And I know that there are still mostly cis men using variations on this line out there in the world, because I have friends who are single who have heard this against their will. Modern versions of it. A pandemic is a terrible time in particular to go out bragging about your gym routine, guys. And Captain America would be making his disappointed face at you, and his disappointed face wins. Your gym routine does not match up to his. Okay? Listen to Captain America and start, like, talking about things that actually illustrate your personality or something.
I feel like this is a great example of the cisheads are not okay.
I personally am doing okay on that front, but wow, those stories just keep getting weirder.
Yeah.
And then in verse 5 we read, "Circumcised on the 8th day, a member of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, as to the law a Pharisee." Okay, so Paul is listing some of the characteristics that he has, some of the things that illustrate the type of person he is and how he grew up. And none of these things are bad things to be, like, at all. There's nothing
Mm-hmm.
wrong with them. But what Paul is actually doing here is he is listing his axes of privilege, the ways in which he has been privileged in his life. And you might also think of this as the biblical version of giving his pronouns when he meets someone, for example.
Mm.
He's explaining that, as John Scalzi, the author, has been known to put it, he has been playing the game of life on easy mode.
Mm.
And doing that can be very helpful in a number of different situations, and is something that we should probably all consider doing more often. But
Mm-hmm.
especially white people.
Yeah,
So,
right. The naming. There was somebody that put, they were doing a gamer analogy of that sort of a thing, and they were like, yeah, it's like your initial stats are race, gender, sexuality,
right.
because those like never change, but then your like other stats can change. So you might start out really low in class, but that's not a thing that is inherent to who your character is,
Right.
and therefore it can change.
Or you might start out really low in dexterity because you're literally a baby, and it would get higher over time.
Yes. Yes, it would.
One would hope.
I mean, you know, I know some people who that's a little bit questionable, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Just occasionally. We all have moments like that.
yeah. And then in verse 7, we read, "Yet whatever gains I had, these I have come to regard as loss because of Christ." And it really shows, right? This is part of what Paul does, is to like say stuff and then say, but really it's about this, right? There's a different set of priorities, new priorities that Paul has found that matter for who and how he is in the world. It reminded me of the series, the Legend series by Marie Lu, where June is part of a military family and has been like top military her whole life.
Sure.
And her parents died when she was young, and then something happened to her brother, and so she's trying to figure that out. And as she learns new things, the things she learns reorient her priorities. And this, I
Yeah.
think, happens a lot with young adult fantasy, especially where the protagonist is part of the elite class or the military or something. But June's priorities shift to align more with with who she thought she was, but realizing how that is different, how the context around her is different. And so she needs to change to meet that.
Yeah.
So it's cool. And then in verse 8, we read, "More than that, I regard everything as loss because of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake I have suffered the loss of all things, and I regard them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ." And the person that I was thinking of who loses everything is in the Ember and the Ashes series. Helene loses everything, and it's part of this longer trajectory, but she loses everything, even down to her mask, which has like melded with her face and is never supposed to come off, and yet she loses it for the sake of other people, for the sake of keeping people safe,
Yeah.
which is a difficult and poetic and beautiful thing.
Yeah.
Then our gospel reading for this episode is John chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. Mary of Bethany, Jesus' friend, anoints his feet, and upon accusatory questioning by Judas, Jesus explains why. So this anointing of feet and the perfumes that go with it are part of burial customs at the time, as Jesus explains, to anoint the dead. They, don't have things like we do to just get rid of scents or take care of bodies and keep bodies not smelling for a while. So that's part of like their burial custom. As opposed to, for example, Tuscans, also known as Tuscan Raiders, depending on your perspective and bias in Star Wars.
So this is Tuskens and not Tuscans.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, not Italians.
Right. Okay. Good. Just checking.
Tuscans, as in Star Wars, and perhaps in the Book of Boba Fett, which I may or may not have just recently started.
Also, like, we're not saying that, the Italians might do these kind of things. The Italians might not. Like, people are individuals, folks. Come on.
Yes, but they apparently burn their dead in the desert.
Sure.
At least when they have mass casualties, they do. Or the people of Gondor in Lord of the Rings might set them to sail in boats on the water, or set fire to them, whether or not they're dead or barely actually still alive.
I don't know that Denethor is really an example we want to use to characterize
It's true.
the
I
Gondorian
generally
people.
don't want to use Denethor as an example, as a positive example of anything.
Yeah.
And most of the time when we see burial customs, we, at least like based on the books and movies I engage in, they're like in the middle of war or tragedy or hardship. So not necessarily going to be the like super on top of it.
Yeah.
Burial customs.
So in verse 1 of our reading, we read, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. Of course, for those of us who actually remembered this story, we also know that he didn't go very fast to get there, so he showed up well after Lazarus had died. So he must have cast raised dead instead of revivify to bring Lazarus back, at least if this was a D&D campaign, which would have set his party back an extra 200 gold pieces, which is a fair sum, especially if you're, only a couple years into your travels together. And so I wonder, did he pay that extra fee himself, or did he make the disciples split the extra cost, or heaven forbid, I hope Mary and Martha didn't have to. But
right.
If he had showed up a little earlier, he could have cast Revivify and saved a lot of money.
It's true, and he probably wouldn't have had to roll a nat 20, which he maybe had to do with Lazarus.
Sure.
It takes a lot of power to raise somebody after that long.
Yeah.
Although, according to Judas, they could have just taken the nard. Use that.
Yeah, probably.
And then in verse 3 we read, Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Not gonna lie, my immediate thought was, wow, that sounds horrible for anyone with any sort of scent sensitivity. I know plenty of people who do, and that's like, it ties back into the abundance,
problem.
Right? The abundance versus extravagance. If you have scent sensitivity, incense is going to be extravagant and not abundant for you, because it's going to make it a lot harder for you to exist.
Yeah, and I've read that same verse, and my immediate thought was that the reason why we don't immediately get people talking about sense sensitivity is because anyone who was born with asthma or other breathing issues would have been dead by this point. Like, generally speaking,
keeping us cheerful,
they died young. Like, we in our modern world do not have a really firm understanding of the massive amounts of people who died in infancy or childhood in these ancient worlds. Every person in that room probably had a sibling who died in infancy or childhood or before this stage of life. And so when you whine about taking other people's sensitivities into account, please remember that the other option is that those people are already dead. So, maybe we should be glad that these folks are still with us and we are able to take their sensitivities into account. You're welcome.
Meeting other people's accessibility needs is good and a gift for everyone.
Yes, and it's a gift from God, because those people are not dead yet. So.
And not just in the not dead yet sense of the phrase.
Yes, absolutely. Also, work in Monty Python at any possible point. That is also one of the gifts that God has given us.
Yeah. And then in verse 4, we read, But Judas Iscariot, one of Jesus' disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, and I read this and I was just like, so usually in literature, foreshadowing is a little bit more subtle than this.
To be fair, with a lot of really ancient literature, like of this time and earlier, subtle is not really a word that gets applied very often.
It's true, and most people
they like to hit you over the head with stuff.
Yeah, it's true, and most people who were hearing this already knew the story.
And also,
or
it's
at least
super
already
useful
knew how
when you're translating from one language into another for things to be really frickin' obvious. So.
Yes, but for example, Buffy's sister Dawn's arrival is foreshadowed much more subtly as a offhand comment while making the bed with Faith in Faith's coma dream.
Sure.
Those sorts of subtle things, not a parenthetical, this is what is about to happen.
Yeah.
Intense stare.
Although that might have been just the kind of person Judas was. You never know.
It's possible.
And now it's time for the newest segment of our show, the Let's Make a Muppets musical, where we talk about these Bible stories that we've discussed and say should we cast any of these people as Muppets? And if so, who? So I wanted to point out that Emily and I have agreed in a mostly unofficial manner to sort of hold off on casting Jesus in this segment for a while. It seemed like a good idea for us to kind of get our feet under ourselves and get a sense for how this whole Muppet casting process would work before we tried to cast Jesus of all people. And
Mm-hmm.
so we're not going to cast Jesus today, or probably anytime soon. But as we look at the stories we read today from the Bible, I think that Janice of the Electric Mayhem Band would be a great choice to play Mary in the Gospel reading. Not just because she actually has the hair to pull the scene off, and very few of the Muppets do, but I think that her personality actually suits Mary's pretty well. Like, if you're going to go with someone who is contemplative and thoughtful and says useful, contemplative, and thoughtful things, Janice actually does that in the majority of the scenes that I've seen her in. I don't know about casting Judas as a Muppet. I don't know that we're ready for that yet. Like, we might get there, but my initial thought was that Statler and Waldorf could just trade off, but I don't think that's actually the sense we're going for with Judas. So
That actually seems really bad since they're like two of the only Jewish characters.
that's also definitely true. Yeah. Well, I have also seen a alternate understanding of the Muppets where like almost all of them are Jewish, but which is a concept that we talked about with Russell a few weeks ago of fandom playing around with the idea of, but what if everybody was Jewish, which is fun.
Yeah. I was thinking about it and I don't know who would play Judas, and I think maybe Judas also
We should wait for a little bit.
some time. Though might come up in our next episode.
Who knows?
Based on the theme. I was thinking about Paul. I was thinking of Miss Piggy for Paul, and it's bad because it's my own like bias against Paul and probably
Oh, I love Miss Piggy. She's
bias
wonderful.
against like I love her, and also I have like not seen the Muppets in a very long time, and so have like the
Well, that's an
key
easy fix.
memories
Yes.
of her as like really obnoxious and full of herself.
Sure.
So then I'm like, yeah, she'd make a great Paul. But in terms of like the credentialing, I actually was like, well, maybe it should be Kermit, because Kermit has done like Kermit is in every Muppets musical
Yes.
and has had so many different jobs and positions and has been so many different things that he would totally be like, oh yeah, I've done this and I've done this and I've done this, and yeah.
I have definitely seen portrayals of Paul where it's like he himself is a fairly humble person, but he had to say all these things in order to make his point, kind of thing. And I suppose if you went with that understanding, Kermit could certainly be Paul. I do find the image of Miss Piggy as Paul highly amusing, if only because that means that Paul would also, be a martial artist and going around saying "Hi-ya!" as he karate chops people, which I think could definitely, like, he has a very dramatic life story to begin with, but that would definitely add another layer to it, and I kind of like it. Also, like, there would generally be more sequins and glitter in his life, which is not necessarily a bad thought.
I think that Paul would benefit from more sequins and glitter.
Yeah, very few people wouldn't, aside from like folks who are actually allergic to the stuff. So,
It is true. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for Palm Passion Sunday with our special guest, Andrea Christian Garnett. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch.
Also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christians said, Pax vobiscum.